If you're interested in using GPT in your automations effectively, keep watching. AI Intent is a plugin created for Node-RED to enable the use of GPT within your flows. Now, the OpenAI Tools Node allows GPT to call functions with specific parameters that you define in order to complete some task outside of GPT's control. This tutorial assumes that you know what Node-RED is and have some basic proficiency in it. It also assumes that your Node-RED environment is connected to Home Assistant and that you have AI Intent installed. Now, if you've never heard of AI Intent or didn't understand much of what I just said, then watch this video over here where I go over the basics and how you can install it. AI Intent has two ways to send functions to GPT. The easiest is the register intent node, and the more difficult but more powerful way is to use the tools node. Because both the register intent and tools nodes are similar, it's important to know when you should use each. The register intent node is easy because you simply give it a name and description, but you can't define any of the parameters. The primary purpose of the register intent node is to give GPT a way to call existing standalone automations that do not require any parameters or special setup. A good example would be a time-based automation. Every morning at 8 a.m., I'll disarm the house, and this automation doesn't really require any dynamic special input, so I can use the register intent node called, let's say, disarm home, and give it a clear description, and GPT will use it to disarm the house. Using the call intent node, GPT would be able to trigger that node, which starts the automation. If you want details on how all of this works, you can watch this video here, or you can check out the link in the description. But we're all here for the tools node, so come gather around. The tools node is significantly more powerful, but it has a trade-off of being more complicated. This is because it allows you to trigger automations that require dynamic specialized input. For example, turning off or on lights. The tools node lets you define the properties that you expect, and you can pass those properties to the call service node or any other node that requires that specialized dynamic input. So let's try a simple and complex example so you can get the hang of how this works. So we have two different examples. One is a simple one where we're going to create a reminder. The way that this automation is going to work is that we're going to send, let's say, some message to GPT and say that, hey, I want you to remind me of something. But as you know, GPT is just a service in the cloud somewhere, and it can't really create any reminders for you. So it's going to need help in order to do that. And it's going to do that by calling functions that exist within your system that can do it on its behalf. Here's how this works. We have the inject node, and inside the inject node, we don't have anything. This is just garbly-gook. Here's the user node, and in it, we're going to say, hey, remind me to call my mom this evening. Make note of that. In the system node, here, we're basically priming the system and telling it, hey, what is the context? So we're telling it that it's a smart home assistant capable of controlling a smart home. And then basically, if it needs to do any commands or take any actions, call the appropriate functions. We're also giving it the current date and time. This isn't the actual date and time, but this is just for demonstration purposes. Okay, right here is the tools node. What makes a tools node complicated is its syntax. It is a JSON object that describes the function that GPT can call. And GPT looks at all of the parameters and properties within this function, and it uses it to determine like what should it call, what parameters do you require, and it gives you all that information back. So let's step through it and kind of get a feel for how this works. So this is an object, it's a gigantic object, and at the top level, we give it a type of function. This is all required by OpenAI, and I will put into the description where you can see documentation as to how this works, because quite frankly, on your own or even on my own, I wouldn't know what to do. The documentation, seeing a few examples, kind of helps you to understand what you can do with this, as there are way more commands and different ways to define the schema. But continue on, we define it as a function, and here we have the definition of the function. This is the name of the function, create reminder. It can't have spaces or special characters. It has to basically be, think of it like a function that you would call in an actual program. Usually the functions don't have spaces, so we're calling it create reminder. I also suggest that you call it a name that is befitting what it does, so that way GPT has an easier time knowing what to call. Then, of course, the description. Make this descriptive, because again, GPT will use its information to determine if it should call it. And then here we're defining the parameters of the function. In order for our reminder to work locally, so if we were to call some kind of reminder service or function locally, we would want to know at least two things. One, we need to know the summary or the title of the reminder. So what are we going to call it? What are we going to put in the reminder? And the next part is we would like to know the due date. And the due date technically is optional. You could just simply put something in the reminder and not give it a due date, but that is something at least we should be cognizant of. I also have something here called the response. I have that there because it just makes the whole experience more pleasant. So GPT will basically say, hey, here's the reminder, or here, I'll make this reminder for you. And it makes it more conversational. And then here in this required section, I'm telling it that it needs to have the summary and we need it to have a response. It will determine on its own whether or not it should use a due date. So all of this defines the function. When this runs and GPT calls this particular function, we expect it to give us a summary, and it will determine what that is. We expect it to give us a due date, and it may or may not do that depending on what we ask it, and we expect it to give it a response. So we're going to get some kind of pleasant response back. Let's run this and see what happens. Here we go. So it called it. Before I dive even deeper, remember what I asked it. I said, hey, remind me to call my mom this evening. I did not tell it what that was. All it simply knows is what I'm asking it. I told it to remind me to call my mom this evening. We told it that the current date and time is the 17th at 2:25 p.m. So let's see how GPT interpreted all of this information. Here's a summary. Call mom. That sounds good. The due date, it's in the ISO format. Correct. And the response. And if you notice on the other side of this T, this equates to about 7 p.m. Am I right? Is that right? 7 p.m. So this worked flawlessly, to be honest. You would get this information and you can pass it to some function within your system that will set this for you. So now Home Assistant has the to-do list, and you can technically use all of this information and use it in the call service node and create your own to-do list or reminders. This is sweet. This is fantastic. Let's keep going. So this is a simple version. Let's look at a more complex function and see how this works. So this is the execute service function. This is a variation of what I saw in the extended OpenAI conversation project. It's a GitHub project written by Jekyllman. Fantastic project. It basically allows you to have GPT within Home Assistant, but like natively. Fantastic project. Check it out. But what fascinated me about it was how he constructed his functions, because it does so much so well. So looking at his functions, mine is a slight variation of that, but still uses a lot of the principles that he has there. Is very similar to the principles that I previously had, but way more refined. So in here, same thing at the top. You have functions. We're defining that this function. Here's a name called execute services. We have here this properties, and in the properties, we have this lists. This list is basically an array that's going to contain a whole bunch of different objects. Each object is going to have a domain, the service, and then the target, which is basically an object that's going to have the following properties of entity. Lastly, down here, I'm also saying that I want a friendly response because, again, it's nice when GPT can respond to you and kind of summarize what it's doing. To make this example go a little bit smoother, I've added in questions into each of these inject nodes, and I'm dynamically passing it to the user node, so that way we can run a bunch of different scenarios pretty quick. Lastly, I want to show you the system node. Again, this is setting up the context of the universe in which GPT is defining itself. Here, I defined it as a smart home assistant capable of controlling my smart home, and that it's going to run the whole execute services function in order to fill commands. I gave it the date and time, which is a fake date and time, but at least knows the date and time. And then I'm also passing it a bunch of entities. Here we have a bedroom light. That's the friendly name. And I gave it the entity name for it, state of off. I have here presence detection. So let's just say that this is like a motion sensor, a binary sensor, bedroom presence. Let's call it bedroom motion. State is off, meaning that no one is inside there. Office lights, lights at office, state is off. Kitchen lights, lights at kitchen, and it's on. They're all going to serve a purpose, especially with the questions that I'm going to ask, so you can kind of get a feel for how this works. So I'll first ask it who's home. It should say that I'm home, Michael is home, and that perhaps I'm in the office. It'll be up to the LLM to kind of phrase how it wants to do that. Here we go. Based on data, Michael's presence is detected in the office. This is correct. Next one. Is there anyone in the bedroom? Now, we should come back with no, or some variation of that. As you can see, the bedroom light is off. The bedroom motion sensor is also off, which suggests that no movement is in the bedroom at this time. Again, to be expected, this is working as intended. Now here we're going to get into the commands, and because we're going to do commands, we expect that the execute services function should run. Let's see what happens when I tell it to turn on the lights in the bedroom. If you remember, the bedroom and office lights are off, the kitchen light is on. All right, let's see what we have. Execute services. And notice that this is different from all of the other ones. Because we're asking questions, when we ran it, we just had args, and that's pretty much it. It gave us the response. But now it's giving us the node name of execute services, meaning that it's running that particular function. Here, turning on the lights in the bedroom lights now. And notice we have the lists. It's an array. It only has one object in there. It has the command of light, or the domain of light, the command to turn on, and the target is light.bedroom light. This is correct. That is how we defined it within our entities that we sent within the system, and that's what we're seeing here now. We're going to tell it to turn on all the lights. Technically, if GPT decided to turn on all the lights, even though the kitchen light is already on, that wouldn't be any big deal. But what we expect to see is the bedroom light and the office light have commands to turn on. Let's see what we get. Here we go. So it gave us 3 objects. Light turn on, that's for the bedroom light. Office light, the last one is probably the kitchen light. So it turned on all of them. In some variations when I ran this, it only gave me 2, which was the bedroom and the office. In this variation, it gave me 3. But again, this is kind of good that you see that, so you can see what you can expect from a system like this. Now, here's the wild card command. I'm curious what it would do if we were to tell it to set the lights blue. So I expect this to go and send me a command for 3 lights, each of them being the command to set it blue. I don't know off the top of my head what that command looks like, so I'm very curious to see what GPT returns back. But realistically, it should be one that would be compatible and correct for Home Assistant. Let's see if this works. Here we go. Execute services. It only gave us 2, turning all the lights blue. So this is partly concerning because we have 3 lights, 2 of them are off, 1 is on. It only gave us 2 back, which means that 1 light wouldn't have turned blue. It did the turn on function. Now, we don't control what it gives us back per se. So I'm wondering if I clicked the wrong button, but I'm going to rewrite. I rewrote this so that way it's a little bit clearer. And let's see what it does. Okay, so it's saying setting the lights to blue. Promising. Has an array of 3, which means that it's targeting all 3 lights. Again, very promising. Let's see what happens. It's saying that it's going to turn it on. Technically, that is correct. That is correct so far, but it's missing some stuff. So it's only turning them on. It's not setting them to blue per se. And reason being is that technically in our function, we're missing a parameter called data. And in that data parameter, we can set it to do a whole bunch of different things. We can watch, this is what I mean. So here within the domain, let's say we go to lights. We don't need to set actually we can set this. We're going to go to turn on, which is correct. But for this particular function, so for the domain of light and the service turn on, here are all of the properties that we could technically call and change. We can have it transition. We can change the RGB color, or we can call it by the color name. We can change the brightness or the temperature of the light. There's a lot of different values that we can call and change within it. But if you notice, we don't have any parameters within, let's say, our function that specifies that allows GPT to pass that information in so it can make the color changes. So this is a very simplistic form of what we would want it to do, but still complex enough to do some amazing things like turning off and on lights. And even if we had, let's say, other, let's call it domains, it should be able to appropriately pass the correct commands to those as well, assuming that we don't need to update like that data parameter that I just showed you. Yeah, this question here was my wildcard question. I added this in at the last moment just to see what would happen, but this makes sense. Like, this was all technically within expectations, but I think it's still good. I still think it's good that you guys got to see that and can kind of be a fly on the wall and see my thought process as to how all of this works, and just to see the different variations of what you could do with it. Because then realistically, once you have all of this set up, this would output and connect directly into call service, and it should be able to, and maybe you may need a node in between to clean it up a little bit, perhaps, because I've seen some of your automations that you guys have shared with me, and you guys have some really good stuff out there. And even for myself, like, I have a little piece in between that will clean it up or aggregate it together. A good example would be like here. We have a command that it's giving us 3 separate commands to turn on different lights. You could technically see that, aggregate them together to say that, hey, I can see all of them are the same domain, same service, but different targets. I'll make one command that targets all 3 things at once, so I send just one command. So you may want to set up a function that does that. So regardless, this gives you that power and flexibility to do that. The hard part was getting all of this information. The easy part would be, hey, you know, how can I aggregate this? How can I improve this to make this a little bit more efficient or fluid, or give me some extra flexibility to, let's say, change lights? But I wanted to at least surface this to you guys and let you get a first-hand look as to how I approach the AI intents and how you can use the tools node to gain some really powerful results from GPT. Hold on, wait, stop. I have one more thing that I need to say, and it's about the tools node. If you check out OpenAI's documentation, they have an extra property within there that is called tool choice, which basically gives you the ability to control how GPT responds to the tools that you pass it. So by default, it's usually on auto, which means that GPT will decide for itself which function to use or whether or not to use a function. Now, for most cases, this works fine. And in order for you to kind of coax it to do what you want, you would have to do prompt engineering. You'd have to tell it within your prompt, hey, use this particular function. And most of the time it works, but you know, it's hit or miss. It's mostly hits though. But there's 2 other properties that you should know about. One is called none, which essentially disables GPT from using tools altogether. So even if GPT sees that there's a tool that it can use, it's not going to do it. It's going to try to figure it out and do it itself. So the last one I find that's interesting is that you can forcefully choose which tool to use. So take this for example. You pass both the create reminder tool as well as the execute service tool. So you know for certain that it's going to create a reminder. Now, there's a good chance that GPT may try to do the execute service tool. So what you can do instead is you can pass it or tell it, hey, just choose the create reminder function and use that alone. What this will do is that this will force GPT to use that particular tool no matter what. Most of the time you're going to want to keep this on auto, but I thought it would be worth letting you guys know that you have the ability to kind of fine tune and hone in how you want GPT to respond or to use the things that you give it. You can find this property within the chat node because this is a property that GPT needs to know or that we need to set before sending everything out. And this applies to all the tools that you give it. Hence, it has to be with the chat node. And one more thing. Just be careful when you are choosing specific tools to run. So within the chat node, when you use a drop down and you select one of those specific tools, the caveat is that that tool that you're selecting needs to be physically connected to the chain that that chat node is in. So if you have, let's say, 4 nodes and the tool node is one of those 4 nodes, you're good. If it's not, then you're going to see a error that looks like this. This is basically saying that the tool that you're trying to use does not exist within the flow that is trying to run for that chat. So make sure that they're connected. I'm still trying to find a way to code some kind of filter to prevent that from happening, or to allow only the specific tools that are attached to that chat node to show up. But the documentation for Node-RED isn't that great, so I may not even find it. But so the error is there for your protection, but I just wanted you to know that. That's all I wanted to say. Bye.